I wanted to add another lesson about sort of a rule of thumb that you can use when you're trying to decide between ES and CX. It's a sort of you can say that it's based on a concept that I don't still have a good understanding of how to explain it. But I think that if you look at this flowchart, you will be able to follow along with what I'm saying. So the thing that you notice in this flowchart is you can see that it's not very wide, but it's quite deep. That is, you can see that there are a lot of levels in this flowchart. It keeps going down, but you don't see that there are too many, it's not very wide in the sense that there are not too many intents which are at the start of the conversation. So the point I was making is, imagine that if you have a lot of intents which are at the start of the conversation. Now that's usually a pure FAQ bot where, like I said, there are no follow-up intents, but you have plenty of questions the user could theoretically ask, right? That you can think of that flowchart as a flat flowchart, right? It's a structure which is very wide but not very deep. So in that sense, it's a flat structure. Now, in contrast, you have something which is very deep but quite narrow. So this one is actually an example of a bot which is quite deep but quite narrow also. And then you would often have a mixture which is neither very wide nor very deep. It will be sort of like a combination. You'll have many intents at the start and then many branches from those initial intents, right? So the idea here is, the flatter your flowchart looks, the easier it will be to build such a bot using Dialogflow ES. And in fact, I'll go as far as to say that such a bot, if you build it in CX, you're probably wasting the potential of CX. It's not even necessary and you're not going to gain much. So in a sense, that's why this flowchart is somewhere you can see it's in between. That is why we also came to the conclusion that this could be built well with both CX and with ES, because it does have, it is quite deep and you do have many levels. And another thing to also look for is how many branches you can have under a single context. So here is your context, or maybe think of it as under this node. This has 2 branches, this has 2 branches. So it's like maximum of 2 for everything. Now, if you want to add some error handling, you will probably have one more branch for all that. So that will be 3, but it's still not a lot of branches, right? And what I'll add is, if you have a bot which is deep, but also it has a lot of branches in the tree, then also CX would be a better choice, simply because, as you might imagine, that kind of a bot will have following the flow of a bot like that would be inherently simpler, because CX has this concept of state machine. Right. So I just wanted to add that, because that would also be a sort of a rule of thumb, but I don't have a good way to describe what I'm explaining there. At least you can say that's not a well-defined terminology, right? It's just something which is more or less intuitive, but it's something to think about as you're deciding to build your ES or CX bot. But I guess there could be some exceptions, and if you notice any exceptions, I'd definitely like to hear those in the comments.